late October 2025, the lights of Moscow flickered and died. Entire districts from Podolsk to New Moscow were plunged into darkness as power grids failed in cascading waves. Satellite imagery from NASA's FIRM system confirmed massive fires at transformer stations in Smolensk and Bryansk, both hit by coordinated Ukrainian drone strikes. What began as a local power outage became an emblem of Russia's internal unraveling. The question now echoing across Europe: how did Ukraine manage to strike at the very heart of the Russian capital? Ukrainian defense sources described October 21st as the final choke of their Strangle Moscow campaign, an operation months in the making. Western analysts told Reuters that Ukraine's new long-range drones, modified for deep penetration attacks, flew nearly 900 kilometers under Russian radar before detonating on Smolensk's main power plant and the Trubchevsk distribution node in Bryansk. These were not random targets. Each was a pressure point in Russia's hyper-centralized energy grid. Destroying them triggered what energy specialists later called a domino effect analysis scenario, a single node collapse rippling outward through power, water, and heating systems. Within hours, Moscow's backup lines overloaded. The Kremlin attempted to reroute electricity from Western supply corridors, but those links had already been severed in previous Ukrainian strikes on Veshkaima and Balashovskaya earlier that month. DW reported that technicians were forced to shut down substations manually to prevent fires from spreading into residential areas. The blackout left millions without light or heating, just as the first winter frost hit central Russia. For Ukraine, this was not merely a show of strength, but a lesson in systems warfare. By turning Russia's centralized infrastructure into its own weapon, Kyiv demonstrated a mastery of asymmetric strategy rarely seen in modern conflicts. The opportunity cost perspective reveals another layer. To stabilize the grid, Moscow had to divert military fuel convoys, generator stockpiles, and engineering units away from the front, weakening its southern operations near Zaporizhzhia. As BBC defense correspondent Jonathan Beale noted, Ukraine didn't just hit power plants, it hit the rhythm of Russia's war economy. The blackout sent shockwaves through financial markets, as investors feared cascading disruptions to oil exports and heavy industry. Russian telegram channels described frozen apartments, failing water pumps, and emergency crews overwhelmed. Social media videos verified by the New York Times showed Muscovites queuing for bottled water by flashlight, proof that the war had crossed from the battlefield into daily life. Yet beyond the physical darkness, a deeper question emerged. Had Russia's long-boasted energy fortress been an illusion all along? Western energy think tanks, including the Center for Strategic and International Studies, suggested that decades of underinvestment had left the grid brittle, 70% of its equipment outdated. Ukraine, exploiting that weakness, simply pulled the thread that unraveled the entire fabric. As power returned intermittently in early November, the Kremlin declared technical sabotage by foreign actors, but few Russians believed it. Trust was melting as fast as the ice in their pipes. Meanwhile, Western observers speculated about what Ukraine's next move might be. What new front could open now that the capital itself has tasted the war's chill? The blackout in Moscow was not an isolated act of defiance. It was the crescendo of a methodical strategy months in the making. Ukrainian defense planners had mapped Russia's entire energy grid like a living organism, identifying its arteries and pressure points. Their aim was not to destroy power stations randomly, but to strangle the system in stages, cutting each lifeline until the capital gasped. Western intelligence officials speaking to The Guardian later confirmed the campaign's codename Strangle Moscow. It began quietly in late September 2025, when drones targeted Belgorod's Luch power plant. The strike crippled electricity and water supplies for over 40,000 residents. Ukrainian analysts treated it as a laboratory test of civilian reaction. Panic ensued, grocery shelves emptied, local authorities lost control, and Telegram channels erupted with images of frozen pipelines. That data became invaluable. By observing Belgorod, Ukraine understood how a limited attack could paralyze local governance, a foundational insight for the domino effect analysis perspective. A few days later, on October 1st, two separate drone waves hit the Rostov region, the command hub of Russia's southern military district. Unlike Belgorod, these strikes targeted logistics and communication nodes, not civilians. Railway command centers blinked out, and coordination between frontline supply bases faltered for 48 hours. Analysts from Defense News described the result as a temporary amputation of the Russian military's right arm. Then came the crucial escalation. On October 16th, Ukrainian drones struck Volgograd's Balashevskaya transformer station. It wasn't the most visible target, but it was the most strategic. Energy specialists told BBC News that destroying Balashevskaya was like removing a spinal disc from the national grid. Electricity flow to central Russia faltered, and emergency redistributions left multiple sectors in overload. 2 days later, Ukraine struck again, this time at the Veshkaima 500 kilovolt substation, located nearly 900 kilometers from Kiev and deep inside Russia. The move shocked observers across Europe. According to NASA satellite data and Reuters reports, the Veshkaima explosion was visible from space. This hub had supplied Moscow with the bulk of its hydroelectric energy from the Volga River. When it vanished, Moscow's grid teetered on the brink. Ukrainian planners knew the Kremlin would try to reroute power westward, so they set the trap. On October 21st, the Smolensk and Bryansk strikes slammed shut the final circuit. This strategic contrast perspective reveals a bitter irony. Moscow's own energy centralization, once touted as a model of state efficiency, became its fatal flaw. Ukraine transformed Russia's strength into vulnerability by forcing it to fight a networked war with a rigid system. Western energy analysts compared the campaign to a surgical siege, one that achieved strategic paralysis without nuclear escalation or mass civilian casualties. The sophistication of Ukraine's drone technology also marked a turning point. Reports in Military Watch magazine suggested that Kiev's defense firms had begun integrating Western AI-assisted targeting systems, capable of recognizing transformer geometries and prioritizing weak points autonomously. NATO officials, while refusing direct comment, privately acknowledged that this innovation had redefined hybrid warfare. As the lights went out across Moscow, one truth became unavoidable. This was not chaos, it was choreography. Each strike from Belgorod to Bryansk was a step in a meticulously composed campaign of systemic collapse. Yet if the military precision was Ukrainian, the structural fragility was Russian. So what deeper cracks would this reveal inside Putin's empire? In the aftermath of the October strikes, what began as a blackout evolved into a nationwide systems collapse, a textbook example of how one targeted attack can ignite a chain reaction across an entire state. Within 48 hours of the Smolensk and Bryansk incidents, Moscow's utility web started to fail, one sector after another. Water pumps shut down, heat plants froze, and urban transport systems stalled. Analysts from Deutsche Welle called it the most comprehensive failure of Russia's civilian infrastructure since the fall of the Soviet Union. But the magnitude of this collapse was not born overnight. It was the direct consequence of decades of neglect, colliding with modern warfare. Electricity was only the first domino. Once power fell, the city's water circulation halted. Without it, apartment heating systems burst from internal pressure drops. This cascading sequence matched the domino effect analysis perspective. In its purest form, destroy a single node, and the chain unravels across water transport and communications. A report from Reuters' Energy Desk detailed how more than 60% of the city's boiler systems failed within 24 hours due to the loss of auxiliary power. Emergency generators, many dating back to the 1980s, either seized or ran out of diesel in sub-zero temperatures. Ukraine had not invented Russia's decay. It had simply accelerated it. According to a pre-war internal audit leaked by the Moscow Times, 70% of Russia's power infrastructure was structurally compromised. For years, maintenance funds were redirected to defense projects or lost in corruption. When the Veshkaima substation went dark, these weaknesses were exposed all at once. NATO engineers observing the crisis from Poland remarked that the Russian grid was a cathedral of rust, one hit away from implosion. The opportunity cost perspective became painfully visible. To restore critical functions, Moscow redirected engineering brigades and emergency fuel reserves from frontline logistics. Military railways carrying ammunition toward Rostov were temporarily halted to transport transformer equipment instead. This reallocation weakened Russia's southern defenses precisely as Ukrainian forces intensified attacks near Zaporizhzhia. The cost was measured not just in rubles, but in tactical vulnerabilities. Western media described eerie scenes: hospitals running on flickering backup lights, people huddled in subway stations for warmth, and volunteers distributing boiled water from makeshift field kitchens. A BBC Newsnight segment interviewed Russian residents, whispering in fear of state retaliation for spreading panic. Their message was chillingly uniform: the war has come home. At the same time, international energy markets reacted violently. Oil prices briefly surged by 6% as fears grew over Russia's ability to maintain refinery outputs. The Kremlin's silence only deepened uncertainty. Yet behind the blackout lay a symbolic truth: Russia's supposed energy superpower status was cracking from within. The strategic contrast perspective made the contradiction glaring. While Moscow had sought to freeze Ukraine into submission, it was now its own citizens shivering in darkness. This was no mere accident of warfare. It was the physics of policy meeting the precision of modern drone warfare. Ukraine had proven that victory in the 21st century need not come through occupation, but through systemic paralysis. But as the lights dimmed across Russia's vast heartland, another question surfaced. How could Putin repair a nation collapsing faster than he could conceal it? By early November 2025, the Kremlin faced a reckoning it could neither spin nor suppress. Russia's military budget had ballooned to more than 7% of its GDP, the highest since the Cold War, while public services withered. President Trump, commenting from Washington, called it a lesson in misplaced priorities, emphasizing that you can't fight a 21st century war with a 20th century economy. The statement echoed across Western capitals and highlighted the central theme of this crisis: the Kremlin's opportunity cost perspective. Every ruble spent on missiles and propaganda was a ruble stolen from the wires, pipes, and boilers that kept Russians alive. In the Kremlin's own reports, later leaked by opposition outlets, officials admitted that more than 300 municipalities were technically bankrupt by autumn 2025. Maintenance contracts for power plants were delayed, spare parts never arrived, and emergency response teams were reduced to skeleton crews. When the Smolensk-Bryansk strikes came, there were simply no resources left to contain the fallout. Al Jazeera's Inside Story broadcast an analysis comparing Russia's situation to a patient bleeding internally while boasting about its muscles. The domino effect perspective once again unfolded in tragic precision. Local governments, stripped of funds, defaulted on wage payments. This caused a wave of strikes among engineers and utility workers. Each absence slowed repair work, extending blackouts and further inflaming public anger. The cost of fuel for generators quadrupled in 3 weeks, forcing hospitals to ration electricity. The Financial Times estimated that these disruptions wiped out nearly $40 billion from Russia's industrial output, a collapse unseen since 1998. Still, Putin pressed on. In televised remarks, he promised a decisive counteroffensive, insisting that our power grid is fully under control. Yet reports from Defense News and DW painted a different picture. Mobile command units previously stationed near Belgorod and Kursk were redeployed to handle civilian emergencies. Military transport aircraft flew spare transformers instead of ammunition. Ukraine had managed to make every repair an act of military diversion, a victory of strategy over scale. Western economists framed it bluntly: Russia had entered a negative-sum war economy. Its effort to project power abroad now drained the very systems sustaining it at home. The strategic contrast perspective revealed a profound irony. Putin had promised stability in exchange for obedience, but his quest for imperial revival delivered only instability to his core supporters. NATO officials in Brussels quietly concluded that Moscow's internal fragility could reshape Europe's security map without a single NATO missile fired. Meanwhile, ordinary Russians faced an unending winter of deprivation. In Podolsk, citizens lined up for firewood as police confiscated private generators for state use. Social networks buzzed with coded phrases mocking the regime's special blackout operation. Even loyal media outlets could not hide the collapse. This was more than a power failure. It was a political unmasking. Putin's social contract loyalty for stability had disintegrated under the weight of its own contradictions. And yet, as the Kremlin scrambled to restore order, the darkness began seeping upward from the working districts to the glittering towers of New Moscow. What happened when the elite themselves lost power? When New Moscow went dark, it was no longer possible for the Kremlin to hide behind technical excuses. This was the elite district, the home of ministers, oligarchs, and senior officers, a symbol of the regime's promised invincibility. On the night of October 10, 2025, as reports of transformer failures spread from Belgorod to Smolensk, sudden blackouts swept through the luxury neighborhoods southwest of the capital. For the first time, those who had funded and benefited from the war felt its consequences firsthand. The New York Times described it as the night the Kremlin's illusion of stability cracked. For years, Moscow's wealthy had lived inside a protective bubble shielded from the hardships faced by regions like Dagestan or Buryatia. The unspoken deal was clear loyalty in exchange for comfort. But the blackout shattered that contract. Panic gripped the city's upper class as elevators stopped mid-flight and security gates froze shut. Without power, their digital fortresses turned into cold, silent cages. From a domino effect perspective, this symbolic failure carried far more weight than the physical damage itself. It was a collapse of confidence. Within hours, private jets began crowding runways at Vnukovo Airport, with flight trackers showing unscheduled departures to Dubai and Istanbul. Western intelligence sources, quoted by BBC News, suggested that several high-ranking business figures quietly evacuated families abroad. Inside Russia, this exodus was whispered as the blackout migration. It marked the beginning of what economists called the opportunity cost crisis. Every generator installed in a mansion was one less delivered to a hospital. Every ruble spent on private evacuation drained the National Emergency Fund. Meanwhile, social discontent spread faster than electricity could be restored. Even state-aligned outlets such as Izvestia admitted that over 1.5 million residents of Moscow Oblast faced intermittent outages for more than 72 hours. In public forums, users began comparing the government's reaction to that of Soviet-era disasters: denial, delay, and blame. "This isn't a Ukrainian strike," one viral post read. "It's a strike from our own corruption." Western experts interpreted the blackout as a psychological blow to the Kremlin's core legitimacy. Dr. Elena Rosenfeld of the Royal United Services Institute told DW authoritarian regimes rely on the illusion of control. Once citizens feel the state can't even keep the lights on, that illusion dissolves. The strategic contrast perspective amplified the irony Moscow once presented as the fortress of Russian power now mirrored the very humanitarian crises it had inflicted on others. Behind the scenes, US and NATO intelligence quietly assessed the strategic implications. According to Defense News, American satellite imagery detected increased generator transfers from Belarus and emergency convoys heading toward Moscow. A clear sign that the Russian military was reallocating resources meant for frontline units. President Trump reportedly briefed NATO leaders warning that Russia's internal collapse may trigger unpredictable external aggression. This confluence of domestic chaos and military strain transformed the blackout from a tactical setback into a geopolitical tremor. The Kremlin's fortress mentality was cracking not from foreign invasion, but from systemic exhaustion. And yet, while Moscow's skyline remained half-lit and trembling, Ukraine was already preparing its next move, one that would weaponize Russia's own tactics against it. What happens when a nation masters the very strategy once used to destroy it? By late November 2025, the war had entered a new psychological phase. Ukraine's operation, now dubbed Mirror Frost by Western analysts, was more than retaliation, it was inversion. Kyiv had turned Russia's own doctrine of energy warfare back against its creator, proving that resilience and innovation could triumph over scale and intimidation. As Al Jazeera noted, the same weapon Russia used to freeze Ukraine is now freezing its own citizens. In strategic circles, this marked a stunning reversal. In 2022 and 2023, Russia's missile barrages on Ukraine's grid aimed to paralyze life and force surrender. But by 2025, Ukraine had decentralized its energy systems, installed mobile substations, and trained specialized rapid repair units with NATO support. Defense experts told Reuters that this adaptation became a living blueprint for postmodern warfare where the winner is the one who learns fastest. The strategic contrast perspective could not be clearer. Moscow had sought to weaponize winter, yet it was now winter itself that turned against Moscow. Ukraine's drone advancements also drew global attention. Military Watch magazine reported that the newly deployed Dovbush 2 drones featured AI-enhanced mapping and autonomous swarm coordination technology developed through joint European research programs. These drones struck with precision, often bypassing radar, by flying at low thermal signatures. Western defense observers compared their effect to the US use of stealth bombers in the 1990s, decisive, minimal, and demoralizing. From NATO's perspective, the blackout revealed valuable data on Russian vulnerability. A confidential briefing leaked to DW suggested that more than 60% of Russia's high-voltage substations remain without hardened protection. The report described systemic exposure that would take decades to correct. At the same time, NATO forces quietly increased electronic warfare exercises in Poland and the Baltic states, testing how hybrid tactics could disable hostile networks without direct combat. A senior European commander summarized it simply: Ukraine proved that dominance in the electromagnetic domain can replace artillery. The opportunity cost analysis adds an even starker dimension. To recover from the blackout, Moscow redirected nearly $15 billion from defense procurement to civilian reconstruction funds, originally earmarked for S-500 missile batteries and Arctic naval upgrades. In essence, Ukraine forced Russia to disarm itself economically. By December, the Kremlin's Ministry of Finance admitted to temporary reallocations, though state television continued to call them planned optimizations. Internationally, the geopolitical balance shifted. European energy markets stabilized as Russian exports dwindled, and Western renewable investments surged to record highs. Analysts from The Guardian noted that Putin's attempt to wield energy as a weapon has instead accelerated Europe's energy independence. Even Beijing, Moscow's uneasy ally, began quietly reducing oil imports wary of sanctions exposure. Inside Russia, however, the human toll deepened. Hospitals still relied on rationed power, food logistics slowed, and in some provinces, mortality rates from exposure rose sharply. Videos of volunteers distributing candles in Moscow apartments circulated online, scenes hauntingly similar to Kiev's own suffering 2 winters earlier. The irony was complete. Ukraine's campaign had achieved what Western sanctions could not. It broke the illusion of Russian resilience. The Kremlin's energy empire now lay in ruins, both materially and symbolically. But as Ukraine celebrated this turning point, strategists across Europe whispered a new concern: if Russia's power grid can collapse from within, what desperate measure might Putin attempt next to reclaim the initiative?